Hi, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Kreick. I'm a partner with Haynes Boone, located here in Dallas, Texas. I'm in the healthcare practice group, and I have Jeremy Sherer here with me, joining us today for a podcast about his recently published article on the top 10 issues for AHLA telehealth uncertainty ahead. So thank you for joining us today, Jeremy. Can you maybe start by just giving me a little bit of background on your work in telehealth and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, and thanks to AHLA for having me today. I'm Jeremy Sherer. I'm a partner at Orrick, based in Boston. I'm a partner in the firm's FDA and healthcare regulatory practice, and part of the life sciences and health tech sector here. I have really focused on telehealth my entire career, which isn't all that long. I'm not that old, but it does mean that I've been focusing on this one narrow area as long as just about anybody. Um, I historically have done a lot of work with, I sort of grew up as a brick and mortar healthcare lawyer, focused on telehealth. So whether it was health systems, SNFs, medical groups, sort of the whole continuum of care, as it were. Over time, I've focused more on emerging companies and startups. So I'm doing a lot more in the direct-to-consumer space these days than I used to, but I still work with plenty of health systems on virtual care issues, Medicare reimbursement, and all the rest of it, but also add to that corporate practice medicine issues and really everything that comes into play when standing up a 50-state virtual practice.
Fantastic. That is great. We are so glad you could join us. So, one of the things that stuck out to me in your article, I thought that it was so aptly titled, uncertainties in telehealth. And we have all these different issues coming down the pipes from a legal perspective. I think one of the big ones that folks are focused on is what is happening with the Medicare telehealth flexibilities. So I think at the time the article was published, those were set to expire at the end of the year. And now it looks like they have at least been extended until March 31st of 2025. Can you give me any thoughts about, maybe a little bit of background? What are the telehealth flexibilities for Medicare purposes that we're talking about? Why do they matter so much to providers? And what can folks really do to get ahead of this and prepare?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess just to quickly bring anybody not well versed in this space up to speed, Medicare has covered telehealth services since the late 90s. At that point, they were more thought about as a way to expand access for folks in rural areas than anything else. And so the statutory coverage standards that are set forth in the Social Security Act, which importantly, therefore, require an act of Congress to modify, really think about that, right? Think about telestroke, think about expanding access to folks who are in areas where they otherwise wouldn't have access to specialists. And so there are standards for these Medicare telehealth services to be covered, separate and apart from state law, which addresses whether services can be delivered via telehealth by those practitioners. But for Medicare beneficiaries and for providers treating Medicare beneficiaries, it's important for the services they provide to be paid for. So the sort of core restrictions that we think about, uh, first is that for these services to be covered and paid for historically, they've had to be provided to a beneficiary who is in a rural health professional shortage area, a rural HIPSA. Um, and that's designed to get at the rural access issue, right? To limit coverage of these services to scenarios where you have somebody who wouldn't be able to access that care, but for telehealth. It's not, it also has historically not been enough to be in the rural HIPSA. You have to be in a specific type of qualifying healthcare facility in that rural HIPSA. So think about a hospital, a skilled nursing facility, a brick and mortar practice, sort of traditional healthcare provider facilities. And importantly, that does not include the patient's home, which in certain ways kind of negates the miracle of telehealth, which is the ability to meet the patient where they are with certain exceptions, right? So in 2018, for instance, under the Support Act, there was a carve out put in place for treatment provided to folks receiving substance use disorder services. But for the most part, there is that requirement that you're in the rural HIPSA and that you're in what's called an approved originating site facility. After that, the services at issue, and again, remember we're talking about initially the late 90s. So the term of art is a covered interactive telecommunications device. I think I have that right.
That is a long, yeah.
Right, it would be, we get, it's a lot of words that mean more or less the same thing typically. But what that, typically what that is meant historically is synchronous audio video, meaning a video visit similar to what we're doing now. And that does not include
Not audio only is what you're
not
talking
audio only. Exactly. And certainly, well, there are certain, and not storing forward, right? Which refers to in historically in clinical disciplines like dermatology, for instance, where it's consistent with the standard of care because the clinician's getting access to more or less the same information they would get in an in-person visit. You can take a picture of a section of, my forehead if I have a skin lesion of some sort, that can be sent to a clinician to review on their own time, asynchronously, so not live. And they can then report back with a diagnosis and a proposed plan of treatment. But historically, the standard under Medicare has been that it does have to be that synchronous audio video. Beyond that, there are only certain types of providers who can provide services via telehealth, and it does cover most of the usual suspects, sort of physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants. But when you get into services that are provided by allied practitioners, think about complementary services like occupational therapy, speech and language pathology, behavioral health services provided by social workers, things like that. They were, and certainly not health coaching and some of the stuff that's happening in sort of the direct to consumer verticals. Services were limited to those provided by those types of providers. And then let's see, rural HIPSA, and then there's the Medicare telehealth services list. So once you've gotten through all of those requirements, then you also need to confirm that it's very elegant, very advanced tech that CMS uses. They literally post an Excel spreadsheet once a year after the physician fee schedule process. But you have to confirm that CMS has determined that the service at issue could be provided in a competent manner via telehealth. So once you've gone through all of those requirements, that would determine, and again, these are in the Social Security Act, whether a service can be provided and paid for via telehealth.
That's
Fast
so
forward,
restrictive. Yeah.
and it's very restrictive, and I think it's not from there's no bad intent here. It's just that the practice of medicine evolves and changes, and I think a lot of states are actually learning from this experience and deliberately creating definitions of telehealth and virtual care and different things that are meant to be able to withstand the evolution of digital health technology. Unfortunately, that's not the case here in terms of Section 1834M. So as a result of that, these standards really just didn't keep pace with the evolution of healthcare technology. And so then fast forward and we have the once in a lifetime event of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant public health emergency. And all of those standards that I just listed were either completely waived or rolled back in some manner, because you had a scenario where, for public health reasons, Congress and everybody else, the Department of Health and Human Services, so on and so forth, wanted to ensure that folks were able to stay home and not leave home. Certainly when you think about—
They couldn't be in the hospital, essentially, receiving these.
or if they were, it was dangerous and we didn't want them there, particularly when you think about Medicare population. You're talking about folks who are 65 plus, with certain limited exceptions, but you're talking about the folks who were in a lot of ways the most at risk for contracting COVID-19, and we saw what happened. So it create, and you also had, at the state level, all states were waiving licensure laws and all the rest of it, but that's sort of the framework that we're working with. And when that happened and all of these standards were either relaxed or rolled back, a lot of folks were forced to utilize telehealth for the first time. Before the public health emergency, it was something like 1/4% of Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries, because there have been more flexibilities historically for Medicare Advantage than there have for fee-for-service. But 1/4% of Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries had utilized telehealth. That changed very quickly, as you can imagine, and folks liked it. That's not to
Hard to
say
go backwards. Yeah, yeah.
that the number of times I can't put the toothpaste back in the tube and all that, but now that's sort of what we're talking about. Um, and so I think, concerns about telehealth replacing in person, I don't think that's reasonable, but I do think that it is at this point a part of the clinical toolkit and something that folks need to be able to utilize. So throughout the pandemic, we sort of ebbed and flowed, and we didn't. Congress didn't know how long it was going to last, and so neither did the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and so. Um, these waivers were incrementally extended over time, and it's become a big issue figuring out post-pandemic how it's pretty clear that we are going to need to modify these standards, but it's not clear exactly what that's going to look like. And there have historically been concerns about overutilization, that if you provide folks the ability to receive treatment via telehealth, that they're suddenly going to use a much greater volume of healthcare services generally. There are concerns about fraud, right? Sometimes it seems to be the idea that, like, when a clinician turns on a video camera, suddenly they become a fraudster. I don't really endorse that theory. But there are some legitimate concerns there, right? When you're providing care in a virtual setting, particularly, and we'll talk about it later, in service lines like RPM, remote patient monitoring, and elsewhere, they are somewhat more susceptible to fraud. And then there have been sort of similar to the utilization concerns, cost concerns. And this is something that MedPAC and Congress have gone back and forth on over time, and sort of trying to find what that next step is going to look like. I don't think that we're particularly close, frankly. I think the most likely outcome to the most recent extension, which pushed us forward into March, is a further extension, so that folks like MedPAC and others advising Congress can have a more robust data set to be able to sort of analyze these trends. But we'll
So
see.
more uncertainty, basically.
There's more uncertainty. I mean, if I were a betting person, I mean, at this point, I think it is safe to. I think it is, of course, possible, right? As a matter of law, we're lawyers here. These standards are set forth in statute. If Congress does not act and there are not further extensions, we will go back to where we were for the most part, with certain minor modifications in terms of behavioral health and some other things that were done outside of the context of the Social Security Act. So Congress did do some stuff, it's just elsewhere, so it doesn't impact these core coverage restrictions. There's going to need to be a middle ground. I think that the just when you look at what telehealth can do from an access perspective, it would be very silly to deny the American public and Medicare beneficiaries of those benefits. We just have to see exactly what it's going to look like.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And appreciate the prediction. I tend to agree with you on, I think we're gonna see it, we have to see at this point another extension, and March is approaching quickly. So I know you mentioned, Jeremy, the kind of government scrutiny and the fraud and abuse aspect. Can
Yeah.
you tell us maybe a little bit about current enforcement initiatives and what the telehealth industry should kind of look out for?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and there are different, I think when we think about telehealth and scrutiny and enforcement agencies and so forth, we're often talking about HHS-OIG, sort of in terms of the traditional healthcare industry stakeholders. At this point, the telehealth industry is quite a bit broader, though, than the brick and mortar facilities that are providing services to Medicare beneficiaries and are therefore under the scrutiny of HHS-OIG. So we also have to think about state medical boards. We have to think about the FTC increasingly. There's fortunately a lot to worry about. So
Consumer protection, yeah,
yeah,
state
exactly.
consumer protection.
Exactly. As sort of you have traditional healthcare services, and with sort of the consumerization of healthcare delivery, you have wellness and traditional healthcare services sort of melding together more and more, and that creates different concerns when it comes to influencers and things like that.
Yeah,
But starting with sort of the most traditional, I guess, enforcers here, and thinking about the OIG. I mean, the latest, and they're always The first thing I'll say is that for particularly pre-pandemic, I mean, there was this whole idea through the Department of Justice about a telefraud takedown, and industry was unhappy about that, and
I
understandable.
remember Operation Brace Yourself and
Yeah,
those. Yeah.
yeah, and like nobody is supportive of like fraudsters just utilizing another way to uh commit fraud, which is a lot of what this was, right? It was there was a new method of care delivery, yes, but a lot of the stuff actually didn't even involve synchronous audio video communication. It was anything involving any sort of telecommunication device, literally telephones, call centers, and things like that, that was suddenly being labeled as telehealth and sort of dragged the industry through the mud. So nobody was happy about that. Um, but more, I think, and there are, right? There are folks who are utilizing this new method of care delivery to perpetuate fraud schemes that are unfortunately tried and true. Think about DME and taking advantage of Medicare beneficiaries, and you find, folks with 14 medically unnecessary wheelchairs or whatever it is. Like there are vulnerable populations who are taken advantage of here, and it's important work that Justice and the OIG are doing. Um, there are continued concerns about remote patient monitoring, which even though it sort of by definition provides for 24/7 monitoring, it is for the most part, there's only limited synchronous interaction required. And there are a lot of first of all, during the pandemic, there were real concerns because, again, in order to encourage folks to shelter in place, stay home, not go to facilities, and potentially spread COVID, um, it was permissible to waive copays for RPM services. And so when you waive copays, you're sort of altering the fundamental equation of an insurance arrangement. And you had a lot of folks advertising just free services. Let me send you this blood pressure cuff. It's not going to cost you anything. Yes, I am going to charge the Medicare program and indirectly the American taxpayer. So anytime you have folks waiving copays, carte blanche, that raises concern. And so there's been an ongoing concern at OIG with regard to RPM, and that hasn't gone away. The most recent report was in September or October of 24, where they identified RPM as an area of concern. And then we saw in the OIG work plan for the next year that they were planning to perform audits in this area. So that's something to look out for. I think more generally, the consumer protection point that you made, Jennifer, is a really good one. And I think there's ongoing concern about transparency and folks understanding who is delivering their medical care. And the entities that are enforcing those standards are coming after folks who maybe aren't being as transparent as they should be, aren't the traditional healthcare enforcement agencies, right? You're talking about the FTC getting involved. You're talking about potentially state attorneys general. You're talking about the state medical boards, and that is all increasingly important in virtual care context. There were a couple of very high-profile investigations during the pandemic involving uh, virtual care and prescribing controlled substances for the treatment of ADHD. Um, I think those are well known, and there were lessons learned there. So of course, anybody prescribing controlled substances virtually, and we'll get to that in a minute. Sure, that's an area of concern. There's also just across the industry, and this isn't specific to virtual care, but I think in some ways we're particularly I don't want to say susceptible, but when you're talking about 50 state virtual practices, there can be concerns from a corporate practice of medicine angle because you are talking about the laws of all 50 states. Not that they all prohibit the corporate practice of medicine, only about half of them do. But there are concerns about the involvement of venture capital and private equity in healthcare, right? And that is, and in terms of protecting the autonomy of clinical decision making when you have a management services organization or an MSO, which sort of takes care of all of the business side of things to allow an affiliated medical practice to focus on delivering clinical care. That is a tried and true structure that has existed for a very long time, but where state boards get and others get concerned is when that MSO entity maybe exerts too much influence and starts trying to exert influence over clinical decision making and things like that. that's an area that, again, this isn't anything new, but sort of annually, there are different states where these issues come up in legislation. Typically, California is one of the stricter states, and um, oftentimes it'll be a very intense sort of battle, and then the industry will sort of breathe a sigh of relief because whatever bill it was that we were so concerned about wasn't passed in that form. But these themes are not going away. So I'll pause there. Does that answer the question?
It does, and I think you highlighted some really good areas for people to kind of, just review and make sure they have all their ducks in a row. Particularly the remote patient monitoring. I know you meant in corporate practice of medicine, kind of investment in healthcare and what making sure you've got the right guardrails in place, that you have the medical practice and I would say, documenting those which decisions are made by the medical practice and making sure you've got good policies and procedures in place and that sort of thing. And then as well, the transparency issue. I think we've seen that come up so much with some of the recent FTC enforcement actions, and some of them have involved kind of tangentially telehealth or to some aspect, at least healthcare providers. And so just making sure folks are, and a lot of that oftentimes focuses on transparency and especially when you're dealing direct to consumer. So definitely some good areas to highlight for folks. And you had mentioned controlled substance prescribing. Can you give us an update on what is going on with the requirements around controlled substance prescribing and particularly in-person visits? I know it's kind of constantly we're hearing things and things are in flux, but what's the current status? And then what do you think 2025 will bring us?
With the qualification that we are recording this on January 16th, and folks will know that on January 15th, we received a 160-page notice of proposed rulemaking. We don't know what 2025 is going to hold. We do know that there was a lot of work done over the last 9 months or so at DEA to come up with a further modified proposal with regard to prescribing controlled substances virtually. The most recent proposal does envision a special telemedicine registration process, which is progress, given that this was something that was actually expressly called out and required and when the Controlled Substances Act was amended by the Ryan-Haidt Act, 2008-2009, but had never been done until this point. So that is progress. Now, what was proposed is extremely restrictive in some ways.
Not surprising. I think from what we saw with the DEA before, it's just, it's there. It's hard to meet everybody's needs, I think.
Right. And there are legitimate concerns about diversion, right? As proposed, and folks can read about this elsewhere, but particularly with regard to Schedule II drugs, the one that folks will be most familiar with, I think, is Adderall and other stimulants that are used to treat ADHD. As proposed, this rule would effectively eliminate the possibility of a multi-state virtual psychiatry practice that treats patients via telehealth. And in certain scenarios, it's easy to understand the desire to, and all of this comes back to wanting to establish a situation where a patient can receive treatment in person if they want it or need it, right? And so the requirements that were proposed included that the physician treating the patient would need to be not just licensed in the state where the patient is located, but physically in the state where that patient is located, in order to be able to provide that in-person treatment to the extent that it's needed. Now, the obvious follow-up question there is, okay, well, what about folks in rural states where you don't have a sufficient volume of behavioral health providers? But there were also steps taken that were, I mean, one thing that's really notable, for instance, is that this was the first time that the DEA has proposed to have telemedicine platforms rather than just the medical groups delivering clinical services. So we talked about the PCMSO structure, sometimes called the friendly PC structure. Historically, the DEA has basically played a game of whack-a-mole, focused on individual practitioners who are maybe prescribing in a way that the DEA hasn't been happy with. This would actually require the MSO entity, where it is supporting practices that are providing care virtually involving controlled substances, to register. And the idea there is to give the DEA a much better idea of who it is out there that's providing these services. There were requirements in there that also relate to annual reporting and tracking of the volume of prescriptions being issued. And so really this all just, I think, goes back to the DEA wanting much more oversight of what is going on in terms of controlled substances prescribing. And look, the elephant in the room, as it were, is that we are about to undergo a change in administration. And with that, it is possible that there will be a change in leadership at the DEA. And a lot of folks are now pivoting and turning to President-elect Trump and hoping that a potential change at the DEA could, those folks are not obligated to finalize this proposed rule that just came down. And so it's a long road ahead. And I think part of what we're seeing in industry, I think as many of us as counsel to folks impacted or companies impacted by these rules, is a little bit of a boy who cried wolf situation. I mean, throughout the pandemic, it was sort of every 12 months we said, well, these waivers are set to expire. And if that happens, this entire business that you have built around the idea of virtually prescribing these medications is going to need to fundamentally change. And the can has been kicked time and time again. Eventually that will stop. But we really don't know. The very unpredictable element that has just been introduced is that change in administration. And so it's something for folks to track carefully. There are also separate rules that were introduced with regard to buprenorphine, which is a little bit different. I mentioned before how treatment of substance use disorder is oftentimes treated differently. I don't know that we have time here. I think I spent too much time rambling about other things, but that's all that via AHLA and the many resources that are available, folks can find more detail about that. But the bottom line is, like a lot of other things with telehealth, I think we saw massive expansion in terms of access and the delivery of these services nationwide in areas. And it's not just behavioral health, right? It also relates to gender affirming care, for instance, was really important. Another area where we saw a lot of advances. And so folks need to continue working with advocacy organizations like the American Telemedicine Association, the Consumer Technology Association, and otherwise to make their voices heard, to make sure that we don't lose the progress from a sort of virtual care, even evangelism perspective, so that we don't lose the progress that we made during the pandemic when we were able to see what telehealth can actually do, really from a public health perspective in terms of expanding access to high quality care.
Well, it's so helpful, Jeremy, and thank you. I'm sure you were probably up all night reading that notice of proposed rulemaking so you could be ready for today. So thank you for doing that. And I think it's great advice, to keep checking with the industry groups and making your voice heard, because that's really how I think the telehealth industry is going to be able to survive this period of uncertainty and that sort of thing. So if folks are looking for more information, I know we've got our virtual telemedicine conference coming up March 11th and 12th. So that would be a great opportunity to check in and see what's new, and kind of where things stand again. And then also AHLA's Health Information Technology Practice Group has a lot of very helpful resources that people can reference. And if anybody is ever looking to get involved, that is a fantastic group to work with. So thank you again, Jeremy, so much for joining us and for all of the really helpful insights that you provided.
Thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate it.